This program has been made possible in part by Interweave, the handmade life, your craft community for books, magazines, videos, patterns, events, and more. On the web at interweavestore.com.
We're lending a helping hand on today's Knitting Daily. Hi, I'm your host, Eunny Jang. I'll begin this episode with a primer on working with pencil rovings. Roving-style yarns are in this season for working big, chunky knits that don't weigh you down. I'll share some tips for winding pencil rovings, needles for working with them, and tips for successfully knitting with rovings by tugging on your stitches and keeping your tension even. Then, on this episode's how-to segment, Deborah Robeson is back to talk about pilly yarns. She explains what makes your knits pill, how to tell if a yarn you have in your stash has a tendency to pill, and steps to take to avoid it. Then join Shay and Kristen on crochet edgings and trims as they look at faux crochet motifs and overlapping them in your finishing. And finally, I'll close with a quick tip on reinforcing threads. Saggy or weak spots in your knitting can be fixed, and I'll demo how to incorporate a reinforced thread into the heels and toes of your socks. So let's begin with rovings. The word roving actually comes from the spinning world. Roving is what you get once a wool fleece has been washed, has been carded or combed, and processed into a medium suitable for spinning. So the roving is sort of the intermediary step between fleece and yarn. And you can see that there are a lot of roving style yarns on the market. They're actually intended for knitting. But if you take a look at this yarn that I have in my hands, you can see that it has very, very little twist to it, meaning literally that it's untwisted. So that means that the roving is quite weak. Twist is actually what gives the yarn its strength. But at the same time, if you take a look at the shawl to my right, you can really see that that untwisted quality is exactly the same thing that can give stitches a really beautiful, puffy, lofty, elemental kind of quality. And then of course there's the fact that these yarns tend to be fairly large in gauge, and you can knit them really fast without having a whole lot of weight to them. So there are just a few tips and tricks that can make working with rovings a little bit easier, and you can be right on trend without a whole lot of angst. So the first thing I want to show you is that I've got some roving, and this is a roving with a little bit of twist in it. But I've got a roving style yarn on a Swift, which is a device that can help you hold yarn open so that you can wind it easily. And you can wind it on a ball winder, such as this one, just sort of a commercial ball winder. And to do that, you need to set it up inside the guide eye of your ball winder, insert it into the slot. Make sure that it's turning freely on the Swift without any snags or any kind of threads that are caught on anything. And then you can just start winding the yarn. And this little device, this combination of little devices really does their job very, very well. Now, however, you might find that with some rovings, particularly untwisted ones, or ones that are twisted in an opposite direction, in a Z direction as opposed to an S direction, which just means, where the twist is going this way as opposed to this way, you might find that the action of the ball winder, which will put a little bit of twist into your yarn, actually untwists your roving or will pull on it hard enough to break it, which is pretty inconvenient, obviously. So you might find that the best way of winding your wool roving is by hand. And a Swift is still enormously helpful for this, especially a lightweight Swift that turns easily. A Swift with a lot of weight to it obviously requires more force to turn and puts more pressure on the yarn, and it will be easier to break. So to hand wind a ball, all you need to do is start with a little figure 8, and that's simple. Just wrap a loop around your thumb, leave a tail hanging, wrap a loop around your thumb, a loop around your pinky, and just keep going like this. And of course, I'm not following my own advice, so you want to make sure that your Swift is turning freely. So get a little bit of yarn onto your fingers, pulling gently with a little bit of lead, a little bit of extra slack so that you're not putting a lot of pressure on the yarn. Then once you have sort of a good handful of yarn, pull it off your thumb and forefinger, fold it in half, and then protecting it kind of within a little cage of your fingers, begin winding gently. And again, you don't want to wind too tightly. You want to make sure that there's plenty of slack in the yarn as you're winding, and that'll help you prevent breaks as well as be able to examine the roving as you work and make sure that it's not, that you're not going to come across any really weak spots, and you can kind of get a feel for the yarn. You can also put in a little bit of extra twist as you're doing this if you want to, or you can, untwist a little bit. You can really mold the yarn to your requirements. So once you've got your yarn wound up into a nice ball, you need to start knitting with it. The best needles for working with roving are going to be fairly blunt-tipped needles, and these are pretty big needles. This is one of the nice things about roving. It's marvelously flexible as to what gauge you work it at. But you want a pretty blunt-tipped needle, and I'm going to move my yarn out so you can see it really clearly. And the reason for that is because you don't want to split any of your stitches. You want to make sure that your needle tips enter into a stitch and never splits the strand of yarn or the strand of roving. So a blunt tip will help you with that. An overly sharp tip will be a little bit more difficult to work with. So when you're working with rovings, just always make sure to just be fairly gentle with all of your movements. So I'm working a long tail cast on here, and I've cast on very loosely, and now instead of just doing the sharp tug that I would normally do with a twisted yarn, I'm actually going to just really gently snug it up toward the needle. And the reason for that is because you want to make sure that A, you don't break your yarn, and then B, that your tension is even. Depending on whether a roving is pulled really tight or whether it's pulled loosely, it can have a vastly different appearance. Just take a look at the difference between those two stitches. So if you go slowly and just make sure that you manually pay attention to how much you're tugging on each individual stitch, you can be sure to get an even effect. Tight or loose is fine. It just kind of depends on what you prefer, but you want to make sure that it's the same all throughout your project or consistent. And finally, once you're actually knitting with rovings, you might find it helpful to work with slightly exaggerated movements. So I've put my needle into my yarn, and I normally hold my yarn in my left hand. With a larger yarn and with larger needles, I find it easier to hold the yarn in my right hand. So when I say exaggerated movements, I say literally gently, just make kind of an exaggerated version of your usual knitting movement. So I'm going to insert my needle, I'm going to take my yarn and gently wrap it around and pull it through. And again, I'm going to gently wrap my yarn. And what I'm doing here is I'm actually letting go of the yarn before I pull it through, or just putting enough pressure on it to keep it in place. I'm actually letting it go so that it can pull through with as much puffiness or slack as it needs. And that will help you too control the look of your roving as well as keep it from breaking and control the consistency of the stitches. When you need a little bit more yarn, take the time to pull it out of the ball and leave a little bit of slack that you can work with before knitting on. And all these tips together will help you make great knits that are right on trend.